The woods behind Coldbrook were not the kind of place children played in after dusk. The trees there grew close together, their trunks gnarled like clenched fists, and the canopy above choked out what little light the setting sun could give. Local parents told stories to keep their kids away, tales of wild animals, old mines, and men who never came back. But those who grew up in the small New England town whispered about something else. There was talk of a tall figure, too tall to be human, that stood in the spaces between the trees. It was said to wear a black suit, though the way the cloth hung made it seem almost like it wasn't really made of fabric at all. Its arms, impossibly long and thin, reached nearly to the ground, ending in pale, spidery fingers. No one had ever seen its face, for where a face should be was only smooth, pale skin. The stories were always the same. Someone would wander into the woods, maybe to look for a lost dog, maybe to take a shortcut, and they'd feel it. That creeping awareness of being watched, the sensation that something was just behind them, even when they turned and saw nothing. And later, if they spoke about it all, they'd talk about the dreams. Dreams of endless corridors of trees, of running without getting anywhere, and of that faceless thing moving silently behind them. It was mid-October when the Calloway family moved into their new house on the edge of those woods. Their backyard sloped down into the tree lane, and from the second-floor windows, you could see deep into the forest-shadowed interior. The house itself had stood empty for nearly a decade, and though it was structurally sound, it had the stillness of a place that hadn't been lived in for far too long. The first nights were uneventful. The air was cold, the leaves had started to turn, and the days shortened quickly. But by the end of the first week, small things began to happen. The family's youngest, 8-year-old Daniel, had trouble sleeping. He would wake up crying, saying he had bad dreams, though when pressed, he refused to describe them. His older sister, 16-year-old Marissa, joked that he was just afraid of the new house. One morning, Mrs. Calloway found small handprints smeared on the inside of Daniel's second-floor window. They were oddly shaped with long, thin fingers. She assumed he'd been pressing his hands to the cold glass during the night, though she couldn't explain why the prints seemed higher than he could reach without standing on something. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift. Shadows appeared longer, the corners darker, and the woods behind the property seemed different. Even when there was no wind, the branches swayed. At night, a deep quiet would fall, the kind that made even the sound of your own breathing feel too loud. On the 10th night, Mrs. Calloway awoke in the early hours, unsure why. The room was silent, but she felt that same primitive sensation, like the one you feel when you know someone is watching you. She glanced at the bedroom door, half expecting to see one of the kids standing there. It was empty. Then her eyes drifted toward the window. Just beyond the glass, down in the yard, a shape stood at the edge of the trees. It was motionless, its outline unnaturally straight against the crooked forms of the pines. Even from that distance, she could tell it was tall, too tall. She blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed by the dark. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, her tired mind playing games. But in the days that followed, both she and her husband found themselves glancing toward the woods more often, and each time they half expected to see that motionless figure again. The dreams came next. The dreams began the same way every time. A gray forest, silent and endless, stretching out under a sky that had no sun, no stars, just a flat, pale light. The trees stood in straight rows, their trunks the same sickly shade as the sky, and no matter where the dreamer turned, the forest continued without end. In the dreams, Daniel always found himself standing in the middle of a narrow path, wearing pajamas, bare feet pressed into cold soil. He would hear the faint crunch of footsteps behind him and turn, but there was never anyone there. The silence after that sound was unbearable. It was a silence that pressed against his ears, heavy and unnatural, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. Then, in the far distance, between two perfectly aligned tree trunks, something would appear. At first, it was just a thin line against a pale backdrop, like a shadow stretched upright. But as he stared, it would take shape. The suit, the impossibly long limbs, and that blank, eyeless face. The figure never moved quickly, never ran. It would simply be closer each time Daniel looked away, like it was folding the space between them without actually walking. For Marissa, the dreams were different. She would find herself in her own bedroom, except everything felt slightly wrong. The walls too tall, the angles of the furniture distorted, the light from a window dim and colorless. She could never leave the room. Every time she tried to open the door, it would lead her back inside, and the shadows in the corners would grow darker. Eventually, she would realize that she wasn't alone. Something tall stood in the corner by the closet, its head tilted toward her in an unnatural way, though she could never bring herself to look at its face. Neither of them told their parents about the dreams. Daniel didn't want to be teased, and Marissa told herself it was just her subconscious adjusting to a new place. But both of them began to wake up feeling more tired than when they had gone to sleep. One evening, a week after the dreams began, the Callaways' dog, Baxter, started barking at the back door. He wasn't the type to bark without reason. His deep growl rumbled as he stared through the glass at the yard. Mr. Callaway went to the door, flipping on the porch light, but the beam barely pierced the edge of the woods. There was nothing out there, or at least nothing visible. Yet Baxter refused to move from his post, his fur standing on end. That night it rained. The sound of it against the roof was steady. But at some point, Mrs. Callaway thought she heard something else beneath it. A faint tapping sound, irregular, almost like fingers brushing against glass. She sat up in bed, holding her breath. The sound seemed to come from Daniel's room. When she went to check, she found him asleep, but the curtains were drawn back, and his window was open a few inches despite the rain. The sill was wet, and muddy streaks marked the outside wall, just below the window. It looked like something, or someone, had climbed up from the yard. By the next morning, the marks were gone. The days grew shorter, the woods darker. The Callaways began to notice more strange occurrences. Lights flickered without cause, objects slightly out of place, cold draft in rooms with closed windows. Marissa swore she saw movement in her peripheral vision when walking down the upstairs hallway, and Daniel, once a cheerful and talkative boy, grew quieter, his eyes often fixed on something far beyond the room they were in. On the first night of November, the dreams changed. The dream came to Marissa first. It began in the woods again, but this time there was no pale, endless light. Instead, everything was drowned in shadow, the trees rising like black pillars into a sky she could not see. She was moving forward, though she couldn't feel her feet touch the ground. Something was guiding her, pulling her deeper. The silence was absolute until it wasn't. Somewhere ahead, a faint scraping sound broke through the stillness, long, slow drags, as if something sharp was being pulled along the forest floor. Her pace quickened without her willing it. She wanted to turn back, but her body refused. Then, through the dense trunks, she saw him, slender. He stood perfectly still, arms hanging like pendulums, head tilted ever so slightly as if studying her. There were no eyes, no mouth, nothing human, yet she knew without doubt that he was looking directly at her. Behind him, the darkness seemed alive, curling like smoke. Long, spindly shapes extended from his back, too many to count, moving in slow, unnatural waves. Marissa tried to scream, but couldn't. The sound caught in her throat, locked there. The figure began to glide toward her, not walking, not stepping, but simply covering distance with impossible smoothness. With each shift of her gaze, he was closer, The last thing she saw before waking was his faceless head bending down toward her, filling her vision. She woke gasping, the taste of cold metal in her mouth. The clock read 3:17 a.m. The house was utterly still. Down the hall, Daniel was already awake, sitting up in bed with his knees pulled to his chest. His dream had been worse. He hadn't been in the forest. He had been in his own room. But the layout had been slightly wrong, just like in his earlier dreams, and the air had been heavy, oppressive. He had heard a faint knock at his window. When he turned, Slender Man was there, peering in from the darkness outside, had almost brushed the eaves of the roof. The knock had come again, louder, sharper, and the figure's arms had begun to lengthen, stretching impossibly until those thin, bone-like fingers slipped through the small gap where the window met the frame. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't even cry out. Then the figure had crouched low, folding it on itself like a spider, before beginning to pull itself through. That was when he had woken. By morning, neither of them mentioned the dreams, but their parents noticed a change. Dark circles under their eyes, jumpy movements, a constant tendency to look toward the woods. That afternoon, Mr. Calloway decided enough was enough. He walked to the tree-line, intent on proving to himself and to his family that there was nothing to fear. The forest was cold and smelled faintly of damp soil and decay. He walked for only a few minutes before he noticed something odd. All the trees here seemed to grow in perfect, unnatural symmetry. It was as though the forest had been arranged deliberately, corridors of which stretching straight in every direction. And then, 50 feet ahead, between two narrow trunks, he thought he saw movement, a tall shadow standing motionless, barely distinguishable from the trees themselves. He blinked, and it was gone, but the air felt heavier, charged with something he couldn't name. When he returned to the house, he said nothing of what he'd seen. That night, the scratching began. The scratching started softly, like branches brushing against a wall in the wind. Except there was no wind that night. The November air outside was still and thick with frost, the trees frozen in place. It began at the far side of the house, faint enough that Marissa thought she might be imagining it. But then the sound traveled, slowly, along the siding toward her bedroom. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Longer pause. The rhythm was deliberate, almost thoughtful, like someone testing the boundary between inside and out. Marissa pulled the covers up to her chin, forcing herself not to move. The sound stopped just outside her window. She stared at the curtains, half expecting them to twitch. Then came a new noise, soft, hollow taps. 3 in a row. Then silence. In Daniel's room, something else was happening. He had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when the light in the hallway flickered. It was faint, just enough to throw shadows across his doorway. The shadows shifted, stretching unnaturally long across the floor, bending toward his bed. He thought he saw thin lines, like fingers, slide into the room without making a sound. The air grew cold. His breath came out in faint white clouds. Then he heard it, a slow, steady inhalation, as though something in the room was breathing. But wasn't coming from the doorway. It was coming from above. Daniel forced himself to look up. In the dim glow from the streetlight outside, he could just make out the shape. Long limbs bent at impossible angles, the faceless head tilted downward, almost touching the ceiling. The figure was clinging there, fingers and toes splayed wide like an insect. It didn't move. It only watched. When Daniel blinked, it was gone. The room was empty, the air warmer, but the fear didn't leave him. The next morning, the Callaways found something in the backyard, a series of deep impressions in the frozen ground, too far apart to be human footprints, but too narrow and defined to belong to an animal. They began at the tree-line and ended just beneath Daniel's window. Over the next few days, the dreams returned with a vengeance. This time, they weren't just dreams. They were identical for both siblings, as if they were sharing the same nightmare. The forest, the symmetry, the endless corridors between the trees, and always, at the very end, Slender Man waiting for them, motionless until they realized they could not wake up. The only way out was to run, but no matter how fast they moved, the figure was always ahead of them. It was Marissa who woke first one night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. She turned toward her bedroom door and froze. It was open. She was sure she had closed it before bed. Something tall was standing in the hallway, its silhouette perfectly framed by the faint light from the window at the far end. It didn't move. It didn't breathe, but she knew it was watching. The nights had grown impossibly long. Even when the clocks insisted the hours were passing, the dark felt like it had thickened, congealed into something that pressed against the walls and seeped into the rooms. The Calloway house had begun to feel different, less like a home and more like a hollow shell, each creak and groan amplified, every shadow stretched too far. Marissa no longer moved around after sundown. She stayed in her room, back against the wall, knees drawn up, counting the seconds until daylight. Daniel was worse. He had started sleeping with the lamp on. Though the light seemed to mean nothing, the darkness would still crawl into the edges of the room, as if the bulb were drowning in it. By now, the dreams came every night, and each one lasted longer. The forest was always the same, but the way through it was different. Turns they didn't remember taking, clearings that hadn't existed before. The symmetry of the trees was suffocating. The air was cold, wet, metallic. Sometimes the sound of running water could be heard far in the distance, though they never reached it. Slender Man was never far behind. Sometimes he would be waiting ahead. Sometimes he would simply appear at the edge of their vision, half hidden behind a trunk, his form impossibly tall, his limbs trailing into the gloom like smoke, and always the sensation of being studied, probed by something that did not need eyes to see. One night, the dream shifted. Marissa was alone in it this time. No Daniel, no sound of footsteps but her own. She followed a narrow path between the trees, drawn toward a faint, unnatural glow ahead. It wasn't moonlight. There was no moon here, but something cold and colorless, like light filtered through deep water. When she reached the source, she found a clearing. The ground was bare, stripped of leaves and soil, nothing but pale, smooth earth beneath her feet. In the center stood Slender Man, not moving, not advancing, simply standing as though he had always been there. Behind him, shapes began to emerge from the trees, figures. They were human, or had once been. Their bodies were thin, gaunt, skin stretched tight over bones. Their faces were pale blurs as if erased, and their movements were stiff, jerky, like marionettes being guided by unseen strings. They circled the clearing, their heads tilting in unison, attention fixed on her. She turned to run and found herself staring directly into the faceless head of Slender Man, now standing only inches away. The space between them collapsed without movement, without sound. The limbs at his sides began to rise, jointless, smooth, extending into black tendrils that arched over her like the branches of a dead tree. The tendrils descended. She woke with a violent jolt, lungs burning as if she'd been holding her breath. Her room was silent, but wrong. The air was colder than outside. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker, layered, as though something occupied them. She sat up slowly, and that's when she saw it, the shape in the far corner of her room, tall enough that its head brushed the ceiling. The light from the window did not touch it. It was completely still, arms hanging unnaturally low. She couldn't see a face, but the absence of one was worse. It felt like looking into a space where something should be but had been wiped from existence. She closed her eyes, opened them. The figure was gone. Somewhere down the hall, She heard Daniel's door creak, not the hinges, a slow, deliberate push. Footsteps followed, light but measured, moving toward the stairs. She stepped into the hallway and froze halfway to his room. Daniel was standing at the top of the stairs, eyes open but unfocused, arms hanging limp. Behind him, the darkness seemed to bulge outward from the walls, as if something vast and unseen were pressing in. He began to walk. She moved toward him, but the air grew heavy, almost solid, forcing each step to feel like pushing through water. The shadows behind Daniel shifted, rising into something tall, thin, and featureless. It bent at the waist, lowering itself until its head hovered just above his. Daniel stopped moving. The thing straightened again, its limbs stretching, unfolding into impossible lengths that reached both floor and ceiling. For a long moment, everything was silent except for the sound of the house, its timbers groaning under a weight they could not bear. Then the lights went out. The blackness was total. No glow from the street outside, no shapes to orient herself. The air smelled of damp soil, the same metallic scent from the forest. And then she heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping, moving along the wall toward her. When the lights came back, Daniel was gone. The front door stood open, cold air flooding in. Outside, the snow was fresh, untouched except for a single trail of impressions leading from the doorway to the woods. They were spaced too far apart for human legs, the stride impossibly long. She followed them to the tree-line, where they vanished into the perfect symmetry of the forest. Somewhere far ahead, something moved, tall, impossibly thin, gliding between the trunks without sound. And at its side, smaller, slower, a boy who did not turn back. She took one step forward, then another, and then she was gone. If you're still here, maybe you were lucky. Maybe he wasn't watching you this time. But tonight, when the lights go out, don't look toward the corner of your room, because if you do, he'll